All right, welcome back to ABA exam review and the continuation of our RBT practice question series. We're going through another set of questions together and breaking them down. If you're new to the channel, welcome. If you're returning, welcome back. Please like and subscribe. Check out btexamreview.com for all of our study materials, including our combo pack. When you pass your exam, please let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. Let's get going. A school principal observes that students are frequently leaving the classroom during lessons. The principal interviews teachers and reviews camera footage to identify patterns on when and why students leave, focusing on what typically happens before and after they leave. What type of assessment is the principal conducting? When we think of assessments, we have a couple that immediately come to mind. We have functional behavior assessments. We have preference assessments. We also have things like reinforcer assessments and functional analyses and task analyses. And so when we're trying to identify what assessment is taking place, we're trying to think about what's the goal. For instance, a preference assessment, the goal is to figure out what someone likes and what might potentially be reinforcing. In this case, we have a school principal who wants to find out why are students leaving classes during lessons. So the principal takes indirect data with interviews. They review direct data through camera footage, and they're looking at what happens before and after, so antecedents and consequences. So the principal is using antecedents and consequences through indirect and direct measures to figure out why a behavior is occurring. What type of assessment would that be? A functional assessment. Sure, a functional behavior assessment, we use indirect and direct data to determine antecedents and consequences to help us decide why behaviors might be occurring. What about B, preference assessment? Well, the principal at no point is looking at what these students like or don't like. They're not looking at preferences. C, a generalization probe. The principal isn't probing anything and they're not programming for generalization. So C is out. And then D, a task analysis. The principal isn't breaking down behaviors into steps. They're looking at the behavior as a whole using indirect and direct measurement to figure out why that behavior might be happening. During session, a behavior technician records the frequency of a client's hand-raising behavior on a data sheet. Following the session, the technician then updates the behavior graph to reflect the most recent session data. What is the primary purpose of updating graphs in this manner? Now, a lot of you will probably use data collection systems that graph for you, right? It's going to be a software or an app that's going to do the graphing for you. But the point of the question still stands. Why are graphs important? What is the primary purpose of updating graphs every day? Why do we use graphs? In this case, this technician is taking this frequency data of hand raising, and then they're going to update the graph to reflect the session data. So every day they might add a new data point and get some sort of graph where we can see a data path. What's the point of this graph? A, to ensure the client's caregivers have access to all session details. Well, this graph isn't going to give any specific details about the session other than frequency, but it's still extremely useful. But A just isn't accurate because there's not a lot other than just the data that are shown from this graph. B, to visually analyze trends and changes in the client's progress over time. Yes, if we look at this graph, this appears to be a steady upwards trend. We can quickly analyze the graph and determine that trend. Graphs are great for visual analysis because we can look at them quickly and start to make decisions about what is happening with the behavior. Always read all of your answer choices. So C, identify specific times when the behavior occurs most often. Well, if these are session dates, it's not going to tell us exactly when behavior is occurring. We have other ways of figuring that out. This is just telling us how often it's happening. And you can graph duration data as well and other types of measurement, but this is just happens to be a frequency graph. D, to prepare for potential changes in the behavior plan. The graph isn't going to prepare us for that. That's going to happen through training and supervision. The reason we're going to update graphs is to visually analyze trends and changes in the client's progress over time. Joe is teaching a client to respond to verbal instruction, sit down. Initially, Joe pairs the instruction with a physical prompt to guide the client into the chair. Over time, Joe fades to physical prompt, and the client begins sitting down independently when they hear the verbal instruction alone. What is Joe implementing in this scenario? So let's break this down, right? We have Joe, he's teaching a client to respond to sit down. That's our SD. Initially, Joe pairs the instruction with a prompt. So we have an SD, then a prompt, and then a response. Now, the prompt here becomes the temporary SD because the response follows the prompt. What Joe wants to do is fade that prompt so that it only is the SD to the response. So what is Joe doing if he's fading the prompt and then eventually the client starts to respond to the SD alone? So we've gone from needing the prompt and the prompt being that temporary SD to now the instruction evokes the response. What has happened? A, shaping. We're now looking at approximations here, right? Joe says sit down, he prompts. He then fades the prompt and says sit down. Joe is not necessarily shaping. B, generalization training. There's no indication that Joe is trying to generalize this behavior yet. He's still teaching it. C, discrimination training. Joe is not looking to train the client to discriminate between stimuli. He's giving them an instruction and he wants the client to respond to the instruction. What Joe has done has transferred stimulus control. He's transferred stimulus control from the prompt to the SD. So when you think about stimulus transfer control, oftentimes that just means we're fading prompts. We're transferring control from the prompt to the SD or the verbal instruction. Sales manager wants to track how many phone calls his employees are making a day to customers. Sales manager is not always in the office to observe his employees. So instead, he just looks at the final numbers at the end of the day. This most reflects what type of measurement by the sales manager. Let's be careful here, right? You have to use all the information given. It is a measurement question, and the manager wants to know how many phone calls. So that's going to be a count, right? How many is a count? However, he's not in the office to observe the employees. So how is he going to measure this if he can't observe it? Well, he just looks at the final numbers. What do we call it when we don't necessarily need to observe the behavior happening? Instead, we can look at the final result and get a conclusion. A, permanent product. Yes, the permanent product for the sales numbers is how many they dialed each day. The sales manager does not need to actually watch the calls happen to measure that. He can look at the permanent product of the final numbers and use that. Now, be careful. B, frequency. The sales manager isn't taking frequency, right? Because he's not in the office necessarily. He's just taking whatever was recorded and analyzing it through whoever took that actual data. Rate could be rate if they're measuring per day. But again, the sales manager is not taking that data. He's just looking at the permanent product. And then D, interval recording. Interval recording is not continuous. This is continuous because he's looking at it throughout the entire day, so it can't be D, interval recording. What type of measurement the sales manager is using is permanent product. A teenager often uses their phone during family dinner despite being told not to. To address this, the parents take the phone for the rest of the night if it is used at dinner. Over time, the teenager's phone use during dinner decreases. What consequence is present? So if we get a consequence question, we're immediately thinking, how is the behavior changing? Well, it tells us the teenager's phone use decreases. So if that behavior is decreasing, it's got to be extinction. It's got to be punishment. Now, what is the consequence? Well, if the phone is used at dinner, the consequence is the removal of that phone. So we have a consequence where something is being removed, leading to a decrease. Is that A, positive punishment? Well, positive punishment, we would be adding something. Is it B, negative reinforcement? With negative reinforcement, that behavior is increasing. Is it C, negative punishment? It is. Negative punishment, we're taking something away that is decreasing behavior. What is extinction? Extinction, we're just withholding something that is decreasing. Nothing's being withheld here. We're taking that phone away. So the consequence present here is C, negative punishment. For consequence questions, we want to think about how is the behavior changing And then is something being added, removed, or withheld? Thanks for watching. Check out btexamreview.com for all of our study materials. When you pass your exam, let us know so we can include you in the Sunday shout out. Work hard, study hard. See you soon.